Out of the 8 languages that I've learned, Spanish has been the one that I've most successfully managed to take out of the pages of the textbook, integrate into my life, and actually use to change the course of my life. But it hasn't been without pain and suffering, a lot of struggle, and even a near-death experience along the way. So in this video, I'm going to tell you the story of how I learned Spanish. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Ollie Richards, and this channel is all about helping you learn a new language through the power of story so you can become fluent faster and live your best life. And in the spirit of stories, today I'm going to tell you how I went about learning Spanish. But this is a continuation of the first video I made, which is how I learned French. And in order to really understand where I'm coming from with this, you might like to start with that video on French because it really sets the scene. I just had my very first success with the language. I'd managed to learn French. I'd spent some time in Paris, and then I'd just come back to London. I'd gone back into the second year of university, which I'd unceremoniously bailed out of before. I was about to start a new life back in London, and having had this success with French, I felt ambition. I was like 20 years old, give or take, 19, 20, don't quite remember. I really felt like I could do anything in the world, do anything with my life, and that included learning Spanish. And so I really set my mind to learning Spanish at that age with a real kind of dedication. I don't remember exactly what it was that sparked the idea of Spanish inside me. I think when I discovered the world of languages and the world outside the United Kingdom when I was 19 or so, there's a lot of things that kind of arrived as a package. It wasn't just French that I discovered. It was there were 20 languages that I could have started to learn back then, but it ended up being French that I learned first. Spanish, though, was a close second. And I remember a couple of events. One thing in particular I remember that sparked my passion for Spanish. And I remember watching the Italian film Il Postino, which is The Postman. And it was about an imaginary tale about the real poet Pablo Neruda. And it's about him turning up in Italy and writing poetry. And that film, although it was in Italian, was talking all about the poetry of Neruda. And so I remember getting a book of Neruda's poetry and reading this in Spanish, kind of trying to figure it out. So I remember sitting there with a dictionary. I could understand a little bit of it already from my French, but there was something about that poetry. Reading that poetry in Spanish, it just sounded so romantic to me as like a 20-year-old kid. And that was one of the moments I remember that just kind of put Spanish on the map for me, put it on my radar. And then I think because I'd just come back to this new life in London, I was ready for the next kind of linguistic challenge. And that really just sealed the deal for me. And I decided to go about learning Spanish. The events that kind of followed are a little bit of a blur for me, mostly because this story of learning Spanish all happened in London, in the UK. I didn't go off and live in Spain or anything like that. I was at home and I was kind of fitting in this study of Spanish around the other things I was supposed to be doing. I was at music college doing a degree in jazz piano. And so that's what I was supposed to be doing. I actually spent a lot of my time learning languages because that's just what kind of grabbed my attention. I do have these images though of rather than practicing the piano, which is what I should have been doing, I remember sitting in my room in a shared house that I was in where was it? It was in Kentish Town in North London. I remember sitting in my room at the top of the house, with this Spanish grammar book, just in the middle of the day, just studying this Spanish grammar and being so totally absorbed in these textbooks. That's kind of the only early memory I have of learning Spanish. It was very traditional, just working through a book that way. But there were a few other events from that period which I remember, and the first of which was language exchanges. Now, language exchanges I had discovered when I was learning French in Paris, and they've been really effective for me. So I remember when I did come back to London, I thought to myself, you know what, I should find someone to do a language exchange with. So I remember there was a time, this is crazy, there was a time when I would take the train on a Saturday or whatever, take the tube into central London, and I would literally just walk around listening for Spanish. And then whenever I was in a shop and I heard someone speaking Spanish, I would go up to that person and say, hey, I'm learning Spanish. Do you want to do a language exchange? I would literally kind of go and just hunt down Spanish speakers and ask them if they wanted to do that. And it's kind of crazy to think that I had that level of drive back then, that I would have done anything to find these people. Of course, we didn't have apps like HelloTalk or Tandem like back in the day. You were responsible for your own, if you wanted something, you had to go out and find it. And I remember meeting this one guy called Marcelo, who was Colombian, and he lived and worked in this pub in central London, and he was really up for it. So we started meeting like a couple of times a week and doing a language exchange in English and Spanish. I was totally new to Spanish, so he was probably teaching me really basic phrases, but I was kind of using that as my way to get started along with my textbook. That's pretty much all I remember doing, really. It was kind of studying my textbook and doing the occasional language exchange. But I do remember a couple of moments where like this Spanish I was learning collided with reality. And the first of those was when I went to visit my friend Gabriela in Madrid. I don't remember how I met Gabriela. It's too long ago. But I remember going to visit her in Madrid and a couple of things happening there. Mostly, like the one event that I remember was she took me out in the evening to this big canteen bar food place like in the middle of Madrid, and a bunch of her friends came along, and I remember a really fantastic atmosphere there, like with a guy, and there's a guy playing flamenco guitar in the corner. We were all drinking beer, and her friends started to come, and they would sit down next to me and she would introduce me, and then they would talk to me in Spanish, and I would try and introduce myself, and then very quickly they would figure out that I couldn't really speak Spanish very well. And I remember my friend Gabriela, like very well intentioned, but she would just sit there translating what her friends were saying to me in English, like for the whole night. And I just remember feeling so like this crippling embarrassment and shame at not being able to understand, and just, I remember my whole body just kind of shutting down. You know, I'd been studying Spanish for months at that point, and then I'd gone to Spain like chasing this dream or whatever. It was just for a few days, like on holiday. But I remember just being so useless, and I remember so viscerally the feeling of not being able to handle it. And that stayed with me for quite some time. I remember going back to London and just carrying on studying as almost as like a kind of therapy or like a way of coping with it somehow. And that's the overriding feeling I have of that first stage of learning Spanish. And it's this kind of combination of like not being able to understand, overthinking everything. I remember trying to kind of piece together grammatical sentences in my head and obsessing over the grammar. I remember I couldn't roll my R. So if I wanted to say a word like perro for dog, I'd have to say perro. I'd have to kind of try and use an L instead. And I remember being so embarrassed that I couldn't roll my R. So a lot of psychological stuff going on there, which I know a lot of people have to like struggle to get to grips with when they're learning a new language. And I suffered that big time. But everything changed at some point, like a year later or around that time, when I took a trip to Argentina. And I tell this story often about what happened to me on the mountain in Argentina. And if you want to see the full video, you can click up here to hear the whole story about what happened. But suffice it to say that I went up a mountain in Argentina, and it was very high up, and I got some kind of altitude sickness. I couldn't breathe, and I ended up getting my breath back, obviously, but because I was too scared to go back to sleep, this was in the middle of the night, I grabbed a book in Spanish and started reading for the first time. And that experience of reading, sitting in the moonlight on top of that mountain, reading, changed everything for me, because that was the first time I'd actually had proper immersion in written Spanish. And I realized that I was remembering a whole bunch of words, that grammar was starting to make sense to me. And over a period of a few weeks while I was on holiday there, I just kept reading more and more and more. And I realized that suddenly everything was improving. I was understanding more, I could speak more. And this began my obsession with stories, and my understanding that the key to learning languages is not through traditional study, but it's through immersion and input in the language. And this is the whole foundation of my story learning method. It all started on top of that mountain. So it was around that time that I stopped studying altogether. My thought process was like, well, I've done all this traditional study, I've been using my textbooks and studying grammar, but all it's been resulting, the results of all of that is just me not being able to understand anything and just getting really tongue-tied whenever I was trying to kind of put sentences together. It wasn't getting me where I wanted to go. And yet, as soon as I started spending time immersed, just letting the language kind of wash over me, that's when I started really improving, because I was able to just see the language as a whole and start to move in that direction, and stopping kind of overloading my brain. That was a very big shift for me. And so essentially I put the textbooks away and I started reading all the time. And that's this was really when my Spanish just really started to take off. But around that time, a couple of things happened. So I went back to London from this holiday in Argentina, and then I met a guy called Tomas. Now, Tomas is a guy from the Canary Islands. He's one of my closest friends, and I happened to meet him at a time where he had just arrived in London to go to the same university where I was, and he really didn't speak very good English at all. Now, at the beginning, because my Spanish wasn't all that good either, we kind of did like a mix of English and Spanish. But what we had in common was the music. Right? So we both loved Latin music. We were both kind of very interested in each other's cultures. So so our friendship was based on things aside from the language, but there was enough kind of in common there that made us want to try to communicate. And this was a great opportunity because there I was in London, finally starting to read a whole bunch in Spanish, listen to as much as I could, immerse myself in the language, and then met this guy who became a really close friend, almost like a brother to me. And we would just basically hang out every day for the best part of 2 years in London. And if you imagine a graph of my Spanish, it kind of went from this to a total rocket ship in that time. And this came from a combination of two things. It was all the reading that I was doing in Spanish, along with the immersion from listening and the opportunity to speak. And so over the course of the next couple of years, I had essentially a Spanish life in London. There were many days where I would speak far more Spanish than English, and it just became a real part of my life. Tomas would introduce me to kind of other Spanish friends of his. We would hang out. I'd go many times to hang out with him in the Canary Islands, where he's from. My Spanish accent, by the way, is from the Canary Islands. Lots of people ask me that, like, Ollie, where did you learn your Spanish? Well, it was from a guy from the Canary Islands in London, so it's kind of weird. I haven't really spent that much time in mainland Spain. So there was very little study going on during that time. This was before the days of Anki, so there were no flashcards or anything like that. I'd already discarded my grammar books. But one of the things I remember doing when I was hanging out with Tomas is we would both be very interested in grammar. And sometimes people think, well, if all you're doing is kind of immersing, does that mean that you don't think grammar is important? And that couldn't be further from the truth. I remember with Tomas, we'd have so many times when we would just be, I don't know, hanging out doing nothing the whole day, and I'd ask him questions like, so man, how do I say, if I had wanted to go through, I don't know, whatever, asking him how to express these kind of complex grammatical things in Spanish, and he would take a real interest in that. He'd tell me how to say it, and then he would also want to learn how to say it in English. So I kind of with his help, almost became this kind of Spanish grammar technician because I was so interested in how to express these different concepts, and I'd learn about the subjunctive in the present and the past forms, and then I would kind of go off and then read, and I would see this stuff there. So it really became a total immersion environment at that point, and that is how my Spanish got to where it was. And I never really studied Spanish ever again after that in the traditional sense, because ultimately, if you can get your language to a level where you're just living and existing in the language, then you really have no need for studying. And I've always been very aware with Spanish and most of all of my other languages as well, that there's a lot more that I could learn. So I don't really consider any of my languages to be at a C2 level, like a super advanced level, because I'm kind of very aware that there's a bunch of more complex grammar that I don't know and vocabulary areas that I'm not really familiar with. But I've also never really cared about that, because I've been so content to have this new language as a true part of my daily life. That's all I really ever want. And so sometimes when I hear discussions about how to get perfect in a language, or or someone asks me a question on some advanced grammar topic in Spanish or whatever it may be, I often find myself kind of thinking, yeah, you know what, I have no idea. Just whatever, I don't know. And it's very fulfilling to get a language to that point where you just are with the language. And yeah, you make mistakes, but you also don't care. It's a very enlightening thing to get to the point where you don't care about making mistakes in the language, because you know that the way that you use it and the way that you interact with people and the relationship you have, the pure relationship you have with your true friends, that's all that matters. And I think that is really kind of perfectly summarizes and explains how I think about language learning in general. It's not about the language. The language is a vehicle to do something else, which in my case is to form relationships with people from different cultures and just enrich my life in that sense. If you've enjoyed some of the stories and anecdotes that you've heard here, then you should sign up for my email newsletter right over here. I send regular emails telling stories about things that have happened to me in my languages, and I draw lessons from there that you can apply to your own language learning so that you can follow in my footsteps and move away from the textbooks and make the language more a part of your life. People really love these story-based emails that I write. They're completely free, and you can click the link right over here to sign up.